So, Beth, just tell us who you are and what you do, okay?
Oh, and skip my thoughts of the other questions till later? Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody, or good day, I think is what I'm supposed to say here. I should say top of the morning to you, right? Oh, that's Ireland? Oh, sorry. What do I say to you?
You say, I fit like, and I go, nay bad, who's yourself, hen?
Oh, I'm giving up. Good morning, everybody. I'm really humbled to be here and to hear my name in that list of people on this panel and speaking throughout the conference. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Beth Searle. I am the Executive Director of Pacific Community Ventures, which is a social enterprise based in San Francisco, California, in the US, obviously. We are all about creating jobs in low-income communities, and I'm sure you've all heard that job or lack of jobs, unemployment is sort of the key issue in the United States at the moment. Particularly, it's really quite heightened in communities of color and in low-income communities. We are a provider of capital, debt, and equity. We are also a leading provider of strategic and tactical supports, capacity building for impact enterprises, and those are any businesses that are creating jobs and have the potential to grow and create jobs in low-income communities. And quickly, what makes us, I think, somewhat unique in this space is that in addition to our work directly with impact enterprises, providing that capital and that advice and those supports, we also operate at a systemic level around public policy issues and best practice issues in impact investing and in growing social enterprise. So we have an understanding and an appreciation for sort of the global group of social enterprises and what it takes, what kinds of policies will make that happen. And we also have on-the-ground experience in the moment. So.
Good day, everyone. My name is En Lee, and I'm part of a Singapore-based organization known as Impact Investment Exchange. It's quite a mouthful, so we abridge ourselves to Asia IIX or IIX. Essentially, our mission is to facilitate increased capital flows into the social sector by facilitating impact investments into Asian social enterprises and funds. Specifically, I head the investor team, where I work closely with about 200 accredited investors globally to help them sort of identify, assess, and to invest in impact opportunities around the Asia Pacific. Just to clarify, that includes Australia as well. We were set up sort of 2 years ago with support from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Asian Development Bank. And essentially, I work very closely with my colleagues back in Singapore to sort of look at various opportunities and to sort of work with investors in that process to sort of invest into these entities. I'm very, very glad to be here today. And thanks to RMIT for having us here and to share with my esteemed panelists our views today on the industry. Thank you.
Well, my name is Nitzuk. I brought Ashoka to Israel 4 years ago. Very happy to be here. I mean, I can't think of a better reason to fly 21 hours to a place. So thank you, Julie, and thank you, Danny, for bringing me here, forcing me to schlep on a flight. So I brought Ashoka to Israel 4 years ago. I have a PhD, so I have a license to teach. It's like a license to kill, right? So I teach entrepreneurship at the Hebrew University. I think you should know what Ashoka is, or I'll give you the brief introduction. Ashoka, as you've seen in the movie yesterday, Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, coined the term social entrepreneurship 32 years ago, and we're serving as something like a combination of a social venture capital, which is also a think tank, trade union, and many other things around the field of social entrepreneurship, social enterprises. And as the field is expanding, we try to expand, and I'll talk about it later today. Very happy to be here. And I also want to say Happy Hanukkah, which is it's one of our Jewish holidays. But if you know the story behind Hanukkah, it's the story of miracles and the story of rebels. And I can't think of a better timing to celebrate Hanukkah than now and here in this context of social entrepreneurship, of bottom-up change. And I'm from Israel. One of our prime ministers said that in Israel we don't believe in miracles, we rely on them. And to a certain extent, this holiday of miracles and changes, creating change bottom up, is our holiday. Happy holiday.
Mark Daniels from Social Traders. I'm really pleased to be here too. Social Traders is a social enterprise development organisation, and we exist to support the establishment of financially viable social enterprises across Australia. I'm not going to talk a lot about Social Traders. I think a lot of the audience is Australian, and you've probably heard of us, and we're going to have a stall running for the entire conference. So, but basically, in 10 seconds, we help build the capability of social enterprises. We open markets to social enterprise, and we try and raise awareness around social enterprise in Australia.
One of the things that you were each asked to do was come up with what you see as the biggest themes that you're seeing in your continent or geography. And you can define your continent and geography.
And the biggest challenge in this was keeping it to 5 minutes. Look, I really wanted to start with a point that 10 years ago in Australia, there was a gathering of people and something formed which was called the Social Entrepreneurs Network. And then people came to it with a lot of hope, and there are probably people in the room who were in those early meetings and participated in SEM, but they came with a lot of hope and excitement about what SEM was going to achieve. And a lot of people also came with egos and conflicting agendas, and so SEN started happily and wound up 18 months later unhappily. And it put social enterprise and social entrepreneurship back in Australia, I think. It certainly slowed the development of social entrepreneurship over the next 5 years. But I think what we saw was spots where it started to emerge. And you know, without sort of blowing Victoria's horn, I think the Victorian government was a real leader in this space. I think philanthropy's consistently supported social enterprise. And I think that we started to see the emergence of intermediary organisations during that time. Everything's really amped up in the last 5 years in social entrepreneurship and enterprise in Australia. And I think there's a few reasons for that. And I hope you don't mind, I'm going to refer to some notes because I've got 7 points that I want to make. The first is that society's changed and we had a global financial crisis. And global financial crisis has been devastating for the world, but it's been pretty good for social enterprise in Australia, to be completely honest, because it's challenged the value systems. And people are now looking for sense in capitalism, and I think they're looking for good capitalism, and I think good capitalism is also known as social enterprise. So it's been good for us in terms of raising awareness and providing an alternative. There are shifts in the way that government purchases services in Australia, and I think that's been a real catalyst for social enterprise as well. And what it's done is created new marketplaces and moved away from funding not-for-profit organisations to putting money in the power of consumers who then go and buy social services. And it's really saying if you're not a social enterprise or a private business, you can't play in this space. And it's really stimulated a range of activity. We're about to see some more of that in disability, in particular with the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The third factor is of interest from government, philanthropy and impact investors. It's just strong and growing, and it's variable in Australia. It's not the same, it depends on the geography that you're in. Fourthly, there's now investment in the infrastructure required to support social enterprise. We've got a small number of intermediaries in Australia, and they invest in, and they build the capacity of, and they enable market opportunities for social enterprise. It's infiltrated universities. And that's in terms of education, but it's also in terms of research. We now know that there are 20,000 social enterprises in Australia as a result of some of that research. I think some of the other things are really interesting. I think the new generation of social entrepreneurs are actually great self-promoters. I don't think we've had self-promoters like this before. And so mainstream media are actually engaging with social enterprise now. I say that in a nice way. And I think most importantly, well, two things. The identity is growing. Organisations that have social enterprises have been operating for 10, 20, 50 years and now calling themselves social enterprises. They're identifying and the movement is gaining serious momentum again, I think. And the other part is that people, social entrepreneurs, keep starting and wanting to start social enterprises. That has been consistent over the last 10 or 15 years. The momentum is still there for that sort of action.
Well, even before talking about continent, I'll take a step back and talk about the movement, because I think there are changes in the movement or the landscape, which were mentioned yesterday, and I'll repeat some of them. Pamela, or should I say Professor Hartigan, right, talked about moving from entrepreneurship to entrepreneuring. And I think we see a great sense of democratization in the field of social entrepreneurship, social enterprise. More people in more places. You don't have to be a Muhammad Yunus or Bill Drayton in order to join the movement. And I think it's wonderful. I think you see more and more universities teaching, more and more people talking about intrapreneurship, changing inside organizations, and basically using the term in a much broader and I think more helpful or more healthy way. Another thing is you see a change in the way people refer to the concept or the movement. When Ashoka started talking about social entrepreneurship 32 years ago, I think Bill Drayton talked about the profession, the social entrepreneur, and the way he or she are changing society. Then people started talking about the field of social entrepreneurship. Then people started talking about the movement of social entrepreneurship. And I think now we're reaching a point in which we can talk about the social entrepreneurial mindset. It's a state of mind in which you see the world, or almost like a new kind of lenses or eyes in which you can see reality. It's not about a profession, it's not about a specific subject or field. It's a way in which you see, or a set of tools or approaches in which you meet reality. Reality bites you, you bite back. And this is kind of an interesting interchange. Now, in our part of the world, in the Middle East, well, let me take another little step back. Some people talk about entrepreneurship as kind of a personality disorder, right? And since, and it has a lot to do with, different priorities and balances in your life, right? And I think it's wonderful to talk about disorders, talking about the Middle East, especially now. I think the main phenomenon we've seen in the Middle East, coming from Israel, I can talk both about the Arab world, I can try, and about my country. There was the Arab Spring, which continues like a never-ending spring, and there was in Israel a summer of discontent, right? Kind of a social protest. And I think the two main themes one could identify in those upheavals or unrests are more people talk about changing the rules of the game, and more people talk about changing priorities. And it's beautiful to see how people are basically entrepreneurial democracy. There's no better way of talking about it. If we're talking about social entrepreneurship as giving yourself permission, if we're talking about social entrepreneurship as yes you can, or we can, if you talk about the bottom-up change, what happens in the Middle East right now is probably the best manifestation of social entrepreneurship. People take their destiny in their hand and change their society. And of course you can talk about business and government and all that stuff. These things are irrelevant. You're creating democracy bottom-up, and if this is not social entrepreneurship, I don't know what is. My last little comment is about what I would be calling impolitely the flying circus of social entrepreneurship. We should be very careful because, as many of you know, the view or the feeling on the ground is much more difficult and frustrating than it looks here in conferences. We have wonderful conferences about social entrepreneurship. We celebrate ourselves. That's why it's a flying circus, right? We go from one place to the other, and all the places are beautiful. San Francisco, Melbourne, why not? Invite me again. As you know, in reality, it's much more difficult. It's much more frustrating. It's extremely difficult to get the funds. It's extremely difficult to collaborate with government or with businesses or with another social entrepreneur. You've heard Bunker Roy saying here, I trust no one. These are people, or we are people, like-minded but with strong personalities, and working in this field is becoming, on one hand, much more fun, on the other hand, much more difficult because of the scale of resources, etc., etc. My last comment is about the hosting country, Australia. Some people talk about Israel as a startup nation because of the high-tech, clean-tech, biotech, and there was a book written about startup nation. Yeah, written about Israel, Israeli mindset. It's lovely. It's my second time here in Australia. Last time was the last iteration of the Flying Circus, right? The Social Enterprise World Forum. It's incredible to see how Australia, to many extent, is a social startup nation. Amazing things are happening, and I wish we could have even half of the initiatives that you have here in my part of the world. We might be able to bring some change or even peace. Amen.
Excellent. And we'll see who's first to tweet flying circus.
I guess I'm on the panel I know I represent Asia. So I thought so. Okay, and we include Australia and New Zealand to that as well. So I guess my first observation, I'm going to make 3 observations very quickly, and the first one is really to bring you to Asia. You hear a lot of things in the press, from Asia Rising to the Asian Tiger Awaits to the Asian Century, and it really sort of underlies the growth of Asia. Asia has been a very a huge major beneficiary in economic growth. We now account for more than almost 30% of the world's GDP. We have first time in history, we have the most number of high net worth individuals in the world today, estimated at 3.37 million high net worth individuals. In Singapore alone, where I'm from, this shocks me. McKinsey has just published a couple of months ago, Singapore has the most number of millionaires per unit household in the world today. Would outpace Switzerland as a private banking hub of the world by 2014. That's McKinsey. Okay, now, so while this is happening, this immense accumulation of wealth, at the same time, there's 750 million people in Asia that live on less than 125 a day. That's ADB, Asian Development Bank, right? Many of these people do not have access to basic services or infrastructure. So how can this be? There's huge inequalities. So I think that I really want to put that as my first observation, because the whole concept of why we're here, why we're celebrating social entrepreneurship and impact investing, is because we see this as very key innovations to help address some of this inequality. So that's really my first point. The second point is I'm quite, having said that, it's social entrepreneurship is really important for Asia and the world. And I see that there's been quite a lot of developments, particularly I think in the past, a lot of people were looking at India. I think when people often, I was in SOCAP, which is a large conference in San Francisco 2 months ago, and a lot of investors are looking at India. But one thing good, and they typically look in sectors like microfinance to education, housing and healthcare. I think they were the traditional sectors that people are looking at. But through the last few years, you really see them expanding, and a lot of funds and investors are looking at Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia, China, right? With focus groups, just focus on various sectors that include clean and renewable energy, particularly in areas of providing off-grid access to a lot of, thousands of villages and households. There is a lot of emphasis recently on sustainable agriculture and aquaculture. At the same time, there's also a lot of emphasis on education. So these are sort of 3 sector interests, and I want to sort of drill down that level to show you where the areas that are sort of particular interest in this space. The last point I'd like to make is a more key one that relates to the industry and why we're all here. I came from banking. With any industry that's created, you need the infrastructure. You need a few things to happen. We always say that in order to create social capital markets, that means you have social entrepreneurs on one side, impact investors, the infrastructure to support it, you need a few things to happen. And I'm very encouraged to say that in the last few years in Asia, there's been, and globally obviously, there's been a real increase in infrastructure and intermediation, right, which is really, really key. So I like to take a view that social entrepreneurs together with NGOs are really the engines of social good. But these engines can't run unless you have the fuel to support them, right? And those are the investors and the philanthropists. They're the ones that fuel all of us to do good. But they can't run on the road unless you build the road, and you have the support services to facilitate that. So in Asia, and thanks to Asian Pacific, you've got organizations like SBA, you've got social traders here. It's happening in every country. I can say in India there's Dasra, in Philippines there's Exchange, in Singapore there's us, IX and Shujong. So there are all these organizations coming out to help facilitate that infrastructure, to help fuel capital across, and to work with very, very innovative and inspiring entrepreneurs like some of you here today. So I'm very enthused to hear that.
Thank you.
I had several points I wanted to make, but now that, when you go last, it changes, kind of, because you've heard everybody. And one thing is that when you ask me, Kevin, about our geography, I struggle with what my geography is. Because in my experience, so much social entrepreneurship in the United States, it has Americans kind of based in the United States, but focused on social impact abroad, which is not a bad thing, but then what's my geography? And I think one of the things we're seeing changing is there is, more, historically, the social entrepreneurs in the United States who got the most attention and the press and the capital were focused in India and in Africa. And I think with some of the problems that we've had at home in the last few years, the financial crisis and the housing issues, we're starting to see more attention paid to impact investing at home and to social entrepreneurship in the United States, with impact in the United States. I actually have written some about what I would call a brain drain of social entrepreneurship, with all these brilliant people, and that we need to pay a little bit more attention. Just, I think, a quick statistic that may or may not surprise you, it surprised me. We had recent poverty statistics in California released, and we have a quarter of our children in the state of California. And California is just under 40 million people, so it's significantly larger in population than Australia, although much smaller, obviously, in geography. And we have a quarter of our children living below the poverty line in the state of California. That is a humbling statistic. So we're starting to see more attention and more investment and willingness and interest in that, and more media coverage, as you were talking about. A couple other quick things. I would say one of the wonderful things that's happened over the last decade is that when you're at a cocktail party and you talk about social entrepreneurship, a lot of people who have nothing to do with it actually know what you're talking about. And that was not the case. I mean, I came to this field 8 years ago from a kind of mainstream private sector career, and it would take me 20 minutes to get somebody to really understand what Pacific Community Ventures did, because they just had no background. It just wasn't part of the lexicon. And now it's part of the lexicon. And I consider that huge progress, that like the average consumer is starting to sort of understand what's going on. Other core changes that we're seeing, the line between nonprofit and for-profit is disappearing. And the concept of those two things as buckets, there's an increasing realization that your tax status is irrelevant. And that it's more, the definition is more about like, what do you do? Whereas early on, social entrepreneur was nonprofit in our world. And now that's really going away, and it's giving birth to the alternative corporate forms. And I think Small Giants is the first B Corporation in Australia. So we have, now you've probably heard some about B Corps. We have flexible purpose corporations and LC3s, and just a whole experimentation in what's the ideal form that will work for providing social impact and attracting capital. And we don't know yet. And then when you ask me what I'm going to see in 10 years, that's going to shake out. A couple other points. The Obama administration is the first administration to have an Office of Social Innovation in the executive branch, where there's federal government attention to social enterprise, impact investing, and social entrepreneurship, and the need to, as Emma was saying, the need to drive the supply of capital, to build the demand for capital, and have intermediation within the impact investing and social entrepreneurship space. And just, like Pacific Community Ventures published with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation its first kind of a framework for thinking about policy and impact investing. And the White House ended up convening a day-long summit on impact investing, sort of talking about supply, demand, and intermediation. That kind of attention, unheard of a decade ago, forget it. And I think the last thing I'll note before we, let's see. Yeah, I think most of the other things have been covered, and pretty much everything that was said is applicable in North America as well. We are starting, and Danny, you alluded to this, where there were individual social entrepreneurs, we're starting to see a movement of being counted in one voice. So PCV is conducting what we call the Great Social Enterprise Census, which is the first effort in the United States, and the European Union and the UK are way ahead of us. But it's the first effort in the United States to take a census of social entrepreneurs, to be able to say, okay, everybody, let's come together and be counted and say, this is what social entrepreneurship looks like in the United States. It's this percentage of GDP. It has this impact and employs this number of people. And with that kind of data, we can start to go to policymakers and say, we need this kind of I don't even want to use the word regulation, because everyone thinks regulation is a negative thing, but we need these kinds of rules for the marketplace that will work post-financial crisis to maximize social impact and and financial return. And so those are sort of, I would say, the themes.